Ladies and gentlemen, the program is about to begin. Please take a moment to silence your mobile devices. We would like to remind you that food and drink are not permitted in the theater. Also, please note that photography and audio and video recording is prohibited. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Michele Gray, the creative and programming director of the New York Times live conversation series, TimesTalks. For over 20 years, TimesTalks has paired New York Times journalists with the brightest and boldest creative minds from the fields of art, literature, theater, social justice, film, and of course, politics. I'm delighted to welcome you to tonight's event with New York Times op-ed columnist Bari Weiss, moderated by Michael Barbaro, a political journalist and host of the New York Times podcast, The Daily. The duo will discuss Weiss's upcoming book, How to Fight Anti-Semitism, a cri de coeur from one of our most fearless writers. No longer the exclusive province of the far right, the far left, and assorted religious bigots, anti-Semitism now finds a home in identity politics and the reaction against identity politics, in the renewal of America First isolationism and the rise of one world socialism. Tonight, Weiss will unpack why anti-Semitism, once reliably taboo, has migrated towards the mainstream and will make a powerful case for how we can combat this ultimate conspiracy theory, not just for the sake of America's Jews, but for the sake of America. Please join me in giving a very warm welcome to Michael Barbaro and the wonderful Bari Weiss.
Thank you, Michele, for that. And Bari's not just a fearless writer, she's a fearless colleague. I've gotten some of the most pointed, spicy, thoughtful, constructive feedback about episodes of The Daily from you.
Thank you, I think.
Than I have from anybody else I work with.
I think the word you're looking for is chutzpah, but yeah.
Thank you for being here tonight. I think everyone's really excited to talk about this remarkable book that you have just written.
Thank you.
And Bari, I want to begin our conversation where your book begins, which is with a text message.
Yeah, so I would say that I had been, maybe like many people in this room, on a holiday from history. I think the American Jewish experience for the generation of my parents and even the generation of my grandparents, who referred unironically to this country as a New Jerusalem, as the Golden Medina, literally the Golden Land. There was a sense that we were sort of inured from what was happening to Jews, not just of other times, of course. We have a very long history of that, but Jews of other places. We were just very aware that things here were different, or so we thought. Yeah. And on the morning of October 27th, I was actually in Phoenix for a talk I was supposed to give there. And I woke up to my family has a group text message, like many families, probably also many Jewish families, and it just said, there's a shooter at Tree of Life. And it was from my youngest sister, Susie. And I immediately leapt to a thought of my dad, because my dad, he kind of is a bit of a wandering Jew. He belongs to many different communities in Pittsburgh. And Tree of Life is a synagogue, not only where I became a bat mitzvah in 1997, but where my dad can often be found on a Shabbat morning. And I wrote back immediately without thinking, is dad? That was all I wrote. I didn't even finish the question.
Is dad there?
Yeah, is dad there? And I found out that he was home still, but my mom wrote immediately, we're gonna know people. And in fact, my dad, I think, knew every single person of the 11 who was murdered. I had met many of them myself. And my plan was to fly to Israel actually the next morning to do a story that I ended up doing months later. And of course, I changed my flight. I went home to Pittsburgh and really to bear witness to what had happened to my community, but also, and I could have never expected this, to be uplifted in ways that I just never could have imagined.
What do you mean?
I knew that I came from a really special community. I grew up in Squirrel Hill, which is literally Mr. Rogers' neighborhood. There's a reason that show came from Pittsburgh. It's the kind of place where people genuinely look out for one another. what I didn't understand was how people would respond to an attack on our community as being an attack on themselves. And this is, I think, not to jump ahead, but one of the critical lessons I think that the aftermath to the Pittsburgh massacre offered the world, which is to say, the attack happened on a Saturday. On Sunday, there was a major event in the Civic Center called Soldiers and Sailors. And it was an interfaith event with, every different kind of person was there from the community. And everyone stood up and said the mourner's Kaddish in Hebrew. Later that week, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, which is our major newspaper, at least for now, ran the words that begin the Kaddish, the mourner's prayer, in Hebrew on the cover of the Post-Gazette. And what that said to me was, it's not only that we defend your right to exist, so to speak, we defend your right to live as full and free and unashamed and prideful Jewish lives as possible, because we understand that for you to do that means that we have that same freedom. And that just seemed like a visceral response, which frankly, in this very ugly time in the country, gave me just a tremendous amount of hope that at least this community understood that.
What do we end up learning about the motivation of the shooter at the Tree of Life synagogue, your synagogue? Yeah,
the shooter, I mean, who knows in many of these cases the role that mental illness plays? And I think that's sort of yet to be determined. There was also a lot of debate in the community about whether or not to pursue the death penalty, and almost everyone in the Jewish community was against it. His name was Robert Bowers. He was a white supremacist, much like many of the shooters that we've seen this year, whether or not they've targeted Jews or people of Latina descent or everything else. And he was very unabashed about his views. He shared them on a social media website called gab.com. I had never heard of it, but it's sort of like an open sewer of bigotry. And he specifically targeted, and honestly, this is a point of incredible pride in the American Jewish community, which is the value of welcoming the stranger. Here in America, like I said, because things have been so good for us, we've been able to embrace sort of open-hearted, liberal, progressive values. We have been able to live out the idea that, the main Jewish idea that's repeated over and over in the Torah, which is, you were once strangers in the land of Egypt, so you shall never oppress a stranger. And one of the ways that that is exemplified is in organizations like HIAS, the Hebrew Immigrant Aid Society, which was founded in the 1800s to help Jews of Eastern European descent fleeing pogroms get citizenship in this country. Today, it does the work of helping persecuted Jews all over the world, but any strangers, frankly, and advocating for them to get asylum in America. The previous Saturday, the previous Shabbat, had been National Refugee Shabbat, which is something that is sponsored by this organization, and Tree of Life had been a participating member in that incredible endeavor. And the shooter had said, something like, F you, HIAS, the Jews are responsible for bringing in, the dirty Muslims and the dirty brown people and the dirty black people. I'm sure he said worse words than that. And that's why, and screw your optics, I'm going in, was the last thing he said. And in that sense, he sort of epitomizes the white supremacist view of Jews, which is that they look like white people, but in fact, they are disloyal. They appear to be like us, but in fact, they are the key betrayers of the white race because they are slavishly loyal to progressive causes, to the Democratic Party, to immigration, to civil rights movement and everything else.
I want to get to that in a minute because there's this complicated nexus between white supremacy and anti-Semitism right now. But I want to understand how this tragedy and your own emotional connection to it leads you to write this book, to go on this intellectual and kind of investigative journey.
I think there are two answers to that. The simpler, shorter one is I was supposed to write another book, and I had a contract to write another book, which I will do after this. But it was really the only thing that I could think about, to be honest. Every time I went to sit down, the stories that I wanted to write were about the rise of this conspiracy theory, not just here, but around the world. I went, after Pittsburgh, I sort of had I always have been doing speaking gigs at different Jewish communities, but it really picked up, and so that brought me into contact with different Jewish communities around the country. And I found that the questions that I was asking, if not yet out loud, but in my heart, the idea that, could it happen here? Was I wrong in my assumption that America was exceptional? Were the questions that were being asked in Jewish communities all over the country. And so I felt really the need to write this in a way that I've never felt anything before. And it's probably the fastest thing I've ever written. The longer answer to that is that in a way I've been writing this book for my whole life. A question I get a lot is, I think a question women writers get a lot is, how does being a woman affect the way you write? The question I get all the time is, how does being a Jew affect the way you write? And it's like asking me the woman question. It's so fundamental to who I am. And it's always been so fundamental to the way that I move through the world. It's not like I just woke up to anti-Semitism or Jewish issues. It's just that it came home in a way that it hadn't before. So a lot of the themes that I write about here are themes that I've been thinking about since I was a 4th grader waiting for the bus with my younger sister, and a Catholic school bus drove by and called us kikes. We'd never heard the word. Or in high school when someone threw a penny and was like, pick it up. I was like, what? What is this? So, there were little sort of vestiges of that uglier.
That happened in Mr. Rogers' neighborhood?
No, that happened in a suburb. But again, and we could get into this, but I view those things as sort of minimal and not really the heart of what anti-Semitism is, and not really the most threatening thing to Jews.
Well, so let's define this word.
Sure.
I know it sounds very basic to ask this question, but
what is anti-Semitism?
As you embark on this book and this project, how do you define, or how do you come to define anti-Semitism?
Okay, so I draw a distinction between anti-Jewish prejudice, which targets individual Jews. And this is the kind of prejudice that says, if you're a Gentile couple, I don't want Jews moving in next door, or we don't want Jews in our country club. It's inconvenient, it's disgusting, it's morally wrong, but it doesn't pose a threat to Jewish civilization and the future of the Jewish people in the way that anti-Semitism does. What the anti-Semite says is there is a secret hand controlling the world, and that secret hand is the Jew. Anti-Semitism is a conspiracy not just against Jewish people, it is a conspiracy that demonizes Jewish ideas, which is why you can have a society with no Jews at all and incredibly rampant anti-Semitism. And so I think what's really, really important is, racism is so fundamental to the American conversation about itself. And so I think in a way sometimes anti-Semitism, quite understandably, gets understood as racism against Jews. But if it's just racism against Jews, then it sort of ranks very low in the hierarchy of our concern, because Jews can pass and do, those of us who are of Eastern European descent, as white. I think something like 15% of Jews in America are of color, so the majority of us look white. So it's not that we can pass as white, and I just lost my train of thought because I made eye contact with someone that I like.
Well, we were talking about this concept.
Oh, what makes it different?
What is anti-Semitism?
Yeah.
You described a kind of a casual anti-Jewish prejudice, of which there's, and you were making a distinction.
Yeah, so it's a conspiracy theory, and it's kind of the ultimate conspiracy theory, and it's not a coincidence, that in cultures where truth has been replaced with lies, where conspiracy theories have come to substitute for truth, anti-Semitism always thrives. And that, unfortunately, I don't need to tell anyone in this room, if you read the New York Times or any other paper of your choosing, that's where we are. We're living in a society where people are, there's conspiracy theories are rampant, and so it shouldn't be a surprise to us that this conspiracy theory, which is really the oldest conspiracy theory of all time, is sort of finding its way into the mainstream. Okay, so a lot of people will tell you that anti-Semitism, begins with Jesus, begins with the idea that the Jews killed the Son of God, the Jews killed the Messiah, and of course, the idea that the idea of the Jews as sort of the wily manipulators of power really has its roots there, because in, I think the book of Matthew is the worst lines ever. It was so bad that Mel Gibson, totally unreformed anti-Semite, I think he's actually making a movie right now called The Rothschild. No, he actually is. Didn't even translate this particular line, his blood be on us and on all of our children, in Passion of the Christ, because it was that incendiary. They just kept the line in the Aramaic in the movie. That is how devastating.
This is a line that implicates the Jews in the death of Jesus.
Exactly. And of course, the idea is the Jews are a tiny minority, and yet they get the most powerful empire in the world, the Roman Empire, to do their bidding. How do they do that? And that's kind of the roots, I think, of the idea of like the Jewish proximity to power and their wiliness and their kind of conniving ability to get great powers to do their bidding. But in the research for this book, I actually found out that the conspiracy theory dates back to 300 BCE. It dates back to Egypt, to Alexandria, which was the largest Jewish community at the time in the world. And it comes from, and you should Google this or read the book, but it's really quite interesting, a pagan priest called Mantheo, I believe his name is. I might be mispronouncing it. And he basically takes the radical Jewish story of the Exodus from Egypt, and he turns it on its head in a kind of original revisionist history. He says God didn't really liberate the Israelites from bondage. They were lepers, and they were ejected by an angry king, and you can go down the line. Basically, at every point of the story, he takes what is an incredible narrative, right, which is this idea of there's no God but God, and idols are indeed idols and should not be worshipped, that slavery is evil, and that people should be free. Takes each one of those ideas and perverts it and turns it on its head. And I guess what I find, it's a dark story and it's just quite interesting, but what I find amazing about it is that he was right in a sense. He was right to see that story as so radical and world-changing and upending. And I think that if you really look, Dara Horn had a really brilliant op-ed in the New York Times about this, and she's a writer I refer to a lot in this book. I just think she has some really amazing paradigms. She talks about how the Jews have always sort of represented freedom. My way of saying that is like the Jews have always been perpendicular to the societies of which they're a part. They don't accept Jesus as the Messiah. They don't accept the idea of idol worship in the Egyptian case. They don't accept the idea that they should bow to a czar. They don't accept the idea in the Soviet Union that they should, disavow their religion. They go on and on and on. And what I find so deeply inspiring is the consistency of our willingness to sort of stand against the tide, even at even in the face of really unspeakable tragedy. And I think that there's sort of like one lesson from Jewish history is that the people who argued for standing against the tide and not bending a knee and refusing to compromise on your principles and your dignity, those were the movements who have always renewed Jewish civilization. That's the Maccabees, that's the Zionists. A lot of the people who argued for contorting ourselves to fit into the surrounding society, those are the communities and the movements that have now been lost to history. That just was not a winning strategy. And so when I see that getting revived in our own time, it's just amazing to me, sort of the echoes from history that we see. I mean, I think of, I can go on, but we can get to it.
Well, we're going to get to it. I want to talk about the structure of your book, because you identify what you consider and you describe as three major sources of the anti-Semitism that you just defined in contemporary times. Three pretty distinct strains of it.
Yeah.
You describe anti-Semitism on the American right.
Yes.
Anti-Semitism on the American left, and the anti-Semitism of radical Islam. I want to start, because it flows, I think, out of the horror of what happened in Squirrel Hill with the right. Describe the anti-Semitism of the right today in the United States.
Oof. Okay, we only have a little bit of time, but I would say that...
Actually, we have tons of time.
Okay, the anti-Semitism of the right is sort of, I don't want to say as it's always been, because it's terrifying right now. The reason, though, that I'll say that it's sort of as it's always been is that it's very straightforward and blunt in what it seeks. The man who walked into my synagogue in Pittsburgh walked in and said, all Jews must die. Kill all the Jews. He's unabashed in what he wants. And in that sense, he's an heir to, the Nazis. He's an heir to Haman in the Purim story, to go really way back. I mean, this is the kind of anti-Semitism that is just very unabashed in its aims. And so in a way, I think there's more consensus, even though right-wing anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism that stems from white supremacy is far more violent. God forbid if someone's going to walk into this room or a synagogue and kill people, 9 times out of 10, I would bet that person's going to be a white supremacist. at least in this country, different in Europe and certainly in the Middle East. So it's very violent, but it's also not trying to pretend to be something that it's not. And so I think that one of the comforts, not that you can say such a thing, but with anti-Semitism of the far right, is that everyone agrees about it. Because if someone walks into a room and says, kill the Jews, or I'm a proud, sort of espousing blood and soil nationalism, and the kinds of things that we're familiar with because we're so living so much still in the shadow of Hitler and what he did, it's very sort of straightforward and familiar.
What are the forces animating it? We started to talk a little earlier about this idea that there is an intersection of white supremacy and anti-Semitism, and I think it's helpful if...
It's not an intersection, it's hatred of Jews is the linchpin of white supremacy.
How does that work?
So everyone should read an amazing essay by an anti-racist activist called Eric Ward. It's called Skin in the Game. I write about it in the book, but it's a really important essay. I'm seeing some nodding of heads, which makes me happy that you've already read it. But he basically explains how the thing that I said in the beginning, right, that the Jews are sort of the hinge point. The Jews are the ones who appear to be like you and me, but really they're doing the aims of these other...
Which is to say white.
Exactly. They look white. Their skin has less melanin than other people, and yet they are sort of in league with the real people who are sullying our country. Obviously, I'm putting all this in quotes because God forbid anyone would take any of these sentences and put them on Twitter. That they are.
Who would do that?
Yeah, exactly. No one in my life. I mean, they're handmaidens of the brown and the black people, and it's exactly as Robert Bauer said. They're the people bringing the dirty Muslims into this country.
So generosity, help to those in need, if they are people of color, is actually, and this is of course, as you're saying, a perverse theory, but the theory goes, they are betraying the white race by trying to bring these people up in society.
They are facilitating the great replacement of America's white people with these other people who aren't real Americans. Mm-hmm. And you hear echoes of that when Donald Trump says something like he did to the 4 freshman congresswomen, 3 of whom were born in this country, 1 of whom is a naturalized citizen. Go back to the totally crime-infested, broken places from which you came, when they in fact were born in America. Mm-hmm. And in doing so, he was sort of, perhaps unwittingly, capitalizing on this long-standing and vile idea of dual loyalty and the idea that citizenship or belonging is provisional, which is something that has long been used against the Jews. They're not really Greeks. They're not really Germans. They're not really Americans.
Mm-hmm. How, as best you can tell, does this kind of thinking, the great replacement theory, this form of white nationalism, how does it reach someone like the man who committed that shooting? Clearly it's the internet, but
yes.
But from and I know you've spent time in some of the darker corners of the web as you've been doing this research, but just how ubiquitous is it in some of these places, and just how accessible and depraved?
It's depraved. I would say it's depraved. I mean, look, I think one of the reasons, and I write about this in the book, that the Jews often talk about that famous ACLU case where the ACLU defended the rights of neo-Nazis to march through the very Jewish neighborhood of Skokie, Illinois. And the reason we talk about that is not just because it's a classic free speech case. The reason we talk about that is neo-Nazis do not generally go marching through the streets of American cities, or at least they didn't until Charlottesville. Mm-hmm. It was exceptional. The reason that it's exceptional is that there was shame before the internet. You had to look someone in the eye. You had to go and find a KKK meeting to attend. Now you can find that virtual meeting, and there's no one looking over your shoulder to sort of cast aspersions. And so I think that it's just much easier to find that virtual community, than it was before the internet. I just think it's enormous. And I think that oftentimes, there's a slippery slope between things that brand themselves as, heterodoxy sometimes, and things that are actually white supremacy. And that's also very difficult.
Mm-hmm. When we think about the right, how should we, and you started to talk about this, think about this president who has a very complicated relationship with Judaism?
Yeah. It's interesting. I'm guessing there's a lot of Jews in the room, and every time I talk before a Jewish audience, I pretty much every time get a call from the organizer that says, don't use the T word, or try and avoid Trump, which is interesting, because I think that our community, the Jewish community, is just much more divided about this president maybe than other people would have us believe, or frankly, that our numbers, 75% of Jews vote Democrat, so you would think that people would be pretty unified. But in fact, they're not, maybe for reasons we'll get into about sort of the president's support of any number of policies vis-a-vis Israel that I myself have supported, like the embassy move to Jerusalem. I think, though, that it would be ignorant to say anything other than the president has facilitated a culture of conspiracy-minded thinking. And as I said before, a culture of conspiracy-minded thinking is one in which Jews are going to be targeted. The president never had to say, the Jews did it. And in fact, I don't even think he believes that the Jews did it. What he does—
Did what?
I'll give you an example. He says things like, I'll tell you who really is responsible for screwing you over and taking away your job. And, it's the globalists, it's the elitists, it's the internationalists, it's Lloyd Blankfein, it's all the dog whistling that we heard in his presidential campaign before he abandoned the dog whistling and just went straight for the dog. There's a reason that people like Richard Spencer were drawn to this president's banner, because anti-Semites, when they hear that language, when they hear someone talking about who's really responsible for screwing over the everyday man, they hear Jew, Jew, Jew. And I just don't think it's a coincidence that those people think that Trump is the greatest thing that's ever happened. I mean, they do.
It's kind of, it is difficult, it is fraught to square that with the presidency that has been so supportive, so outspokenly supportive of Israel, and inspired so many people who care about Israel.
It is. Should I talk about that?
I wonder how you think about it, yeah.
Well,
is it possible to divorce those two things?
Yes. I think it's important to divorce those two things. I think George Will sort of said it best when he said, Trump is ringing a bell that cannot be unrung. Policies can be undone, good policies and bad policies. What cannot be undone is the dismantling of decency, of, I know people hate this word now, civility, of a sense that we are all Americans and fundamentally in something together. The president has dismantled the moral guardrails of what sort of keeps us together. And that scares me more than anything. That scares me as a Jew, and that scares me as an American. Mm-hmm. And that is why I fundamentally think that Jews who are concerned about the future, not just of themselves as a Jewish people, but the future of the greatest democracy the world has ever seen, should oppose this president. Because I just see him destroying things that I'm very, very scared that just will not be able to be easily rebuilt. That was a mangled way of saying what I wanted to say.
How does that go over with Jewish audiences when you talk to them?
Mixed bag. I understand why people, look, if we had a Democratic Party where people felt that the future of the Democratic Party were people like Max Rose in Staten Island and Chuck Schumer and Joe Biden, I don't think that there would be as much, I was going for a Yiddish word, but I didn't remember it. I don't think that there would be as much.
Do you want to call a friend?
Yeah, I think I should phone a friend. I don't think there would be as much belly aching about it. But when people fear that the Democratic Party, that the sort of wins are at the back of people like AOC and Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib, they're like, hold on a minute. And they look across the pond at labor and what Jeremy Corbyn has done to labor, and they're like, is there really a home for us there anymore? And what I feel increasingly from Jews everywhere I go is a sense of just profound political homelessness. It's like, right now we have a Republican Party where it's asking you to check values that have been Jewish American values that we are deeply proud of, that are about welcoming the stranger, that are about embracing the immigrant, that are about, you know, being at the forefront of just so many progressive movements in this country. And it's asking you to abandon that. And it's saying increasingly that to be a real American is to be against those things. And it's to be white and it's to be Christian. And you know, it's just it's the antithesis of sort of the party of the underdog that immigrants who are fleeing pogroms in Eastern Europe, just to speak of the Ashkenazi Jewish experience, that was an anathema to those people. But now increasingly, unfortunately, on the far left of the Democratic Party, and you see it just kind of seeping in, you see a politics that we just know from what's going on in England that is deeply, deeply hostile to Jewish ideas, to the idea of Jewish power fundamentally, to the idea of Jewish sovereignty. And that is just really, really worrisome.
So you have teed us up to talk about the left.
Wasn't that a nice transition?
Yeah, it was a beautiful transition. You should come on the Daily and do these kinds of transitions. If the anti-Semitism on the right is bound up in this concept of replacement, what form in your mind does it take on the left?
So whiteness, so one thing to remember always in your mind about anti-Semitism is that the Jews in the anti-Semitic conspiracy theory come to signify whatever a given society or subculture defines as its most loathsome qualities. So this is why under communism, the Jews are the arch capitalists, why under Nazism, they're the race contaminators, and why, at least in the circles in which many of us in this room travel, living in a blue state, living in, you know, if you look at the map of the New York Times, places where there's a lot of Democratic Party support, where the main evils are colonialism and white supremacy. And there is a huge lie that has been told about Israel, which is that it is the last standing bastion of white colonialism in the Middle East. And so therefore, the sort of the Jew in that framework is the Jewish state in this moment. And so I think that—
So Israel is the animating, Israel and the idea of Israel as a kind of oppressor is the animating force on the left.
Right, and the reason that whiteness is important is because it is obviously a truism that Jews can pass as white. But when the far left says white Jews or Jews are white people, what that is about is the forcible conversion of Jews into the oppressor category. And it's saying, unless you disavow—
It's a fascinating inversion of whiteness.
It's exactly the mirror, right? Because it makes sense. On the left, a bad thing to be right now, the far left, is white. I mean, I'm speaking in crude terms. On the far right, the bad thing to be, the most loathsome thing, is not loyal to whiteness. And so that is sort of how it's functioning. And one of the things that I was just fascinated by when I started writing this book is like, hold on. Since 1995, I think according to the FBI, the Jews have been the #1 victim of religiously motivated hate crimes in this country. In 2018, there were 4 times as many hate crimes against Jews than against blacks in New York City. So somehow that is like totally getting lost, and we hear a group saying, no, 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 Jews really can't be victims. They're the white people, they're the privileged people, they're the successful people. And I think that there is just something deeply, deeply dangerous about that, because it blinds us to, for example, the fact that in the last week of the summer, there were, I think, 4 violent hate crimes against ultra-Orthodox Jews in Brooklyn. One of them was beaten by his own belt. The other one was pelted in the face with a brick. Somehow that didn't make the news. And I think that there is a reason for that, and that is that it does not fit the narrative of who is the right oppressor and who is the right victim. Just imagine that happening to another minority group in Brooklyn. Can you imagine what the reaction of that would be? And yet I mentioned it to someone the other day, and they had a very educated person. They had no idea what I was talking about. And I think that if you want to see the upshot of what that ideology looks like, it's the sort of lack of curiosity about that story and the intense focus on when the perpetrators are white supremacists, and there should be, but why not equally so in the other case?
You write that American Jews, quote, tend to be much more attuned to anti-Semitism when it comes on the political right, by which I understood you to be saying that Jews on the left are less attuned to seeing it in their own midst.
Because it's really uncomfortable. It's like because Jews, by and large, live inside the left, and I mean that in a broad way, it's like imagining that the enemy is inside your own living room, as opposed to across the street. And, you know, I think a lot about that, like Susan Sontag line, that communism's fascism with a human face. And that is a lot of what I think anti-Semitism on the left is. It cloaks itself in language that is deeply seductive to Jewish ears. It's the language that's on our own tongues. It's the language of justice.
Tell me this language.
It says, we are pursuing justice. We are fighting racism. We are, you know, for the brotherhood of, I mean, it's all of the language that is super familiar to us. I'll give you a really good example, which is that on the ill-fated trip that Ilhan Omar and Rashida Tlaib were going to take to what they called Palestine, by which they meant Israel proper and the West Bank, they were being sponsored, or the trip was being organized by an organization called Miftah. And this group, Miftah, not only has glorified suicide bombers as heroes, it has literally published the medieval blood libel, the idea that the Jews need the blood of Christians to make their Passover matzah, okay? That was not covered. I mean, I talked about it in the 1 minute I was on CNN. Again, story like majorly overlooked. And yet if you go to the website of Miftah, it frames itself as, we are for promoting peace in the Middle East and the promotion of Palestinian rights. You should look it up, but it's something exactly along those lines. And that is the way that it was described by people. Now, would we say that that's what a group that promotes the medieval blood libel is? Of course not. But because that is how they frame themselves, and that language is so sort of seductive to us and it's so attractive, okay, yeah, we'll go with that. That's not what it is at all.
This reminds me of something else you wrote in your book, which is that the language of the left, you wrote, allows anti-Semitism to be smuggled into the mainstream. What do you mean by that?
I think that's putting it well. That's what I mean.
These are your words, yeah.
Yeah, thank you. I'm like, okay. Yeah, good ghostwriter, I guess. I mean, should we use a specific example?
I think we should.
Okay.
I think you should.
Like BDS? Where should I go here?
Yes? I'm not sure if anyone needs convincing of this, but I want to understand the degree to which you believe and see it come to life that anti-Semitism on the left is somehow casually introduced in the left and not seen for what you think of it as.
Sure. Well, let's take anti-Zionism. Okay, anti-Zionism, 10 years ago, if you asked me, is anti-Zionism anti-Semitism, I probably honestly would have said no. And I would have said no because, you know, I spend enough time in places like Brooklyn where people are talking about ideas that would have a home in a college seminar, like nation states, for example, the argument of nation states don't have a right to exist, you know, we should live in a world without nation states and therefore Israel shouldn't exist. Okay. That is kind of like the one way you can be an anti-Zionist and not be abetting, even if unwittingly, anti-Semitism, is if you're an anarchist that believes that China shouldn't exist and America shouldn't exist and Israel shouldn't exist. I grant you that out. Other than that, being an anti-Zionist is about the denial of 5,000 years of Jewish yearning. Being an anti-Zionist is about believing that the largest Jewish community on planet Earth, not to mention the largest Jewish community of color in the world, the majority, I think, of Israelis are now of Mizrahi descent and not Ashkenazi descent, does not have a right to exist. And yet people are talking about anti-Zionism as if it's like a normal thing to believe in. And it's become, and it's become sort of a plank of progressivism. And what I mean by that is, if you're just a college student showing up on
I want to challenge that.
Sure.
You've just claimed that anti-Zionism is a plank of progressivism.
I'm not saying everywhere, and I'm not saying every progressive, but I'm saying it has become more and more normative, if you're on a college campus, let's say, to believe, you know, in racial justice, to believe that we should legalize marijuana and maybe hallucinogenic mushrooms, to believe that, you know, the minimum wage should be raised to $15 an hour, and to believe that one state of all the states maybe doesn't have a right to exist. That's crazy. Like, that is crazy. And the fact that that has become just sort of in the normal waters of progressivism, or maybe let's be generous and just say the far left, that's unbelievable to me. How can, I mean, and I don't want to get into it too much here, but I think that it's really important to understand that when people are talking about Zionism as racism, they are parroting a Soviet lie. They are parroting a piece of Soviet propaganda that was sort of enacted when the Soviet Union could not literally beat the West through its proxy states in the Arab world against Israel. It went to a propaganda war. And you see that playing out in the precincts of progressivism all over the place. You see it playing out at the UN. There was that amazing thing from the UN that you wanted me to talk about. But yeah, okay, so for example, between 2006 and 2016, there were 68 votes in the United Nations Human Rights Council censoring the Jewish state. There were 6, I believe, against North Korea. There were 0 against China, 0 against Saudi Arabia, and 0 against Pakistan. These are places where there's actual genocide, where there's honor killings, and where there's just any number of things that are like the most atrocious human rights abuses in the world. How do you explain that, if not for this kind of conspiracy theory that my book is about?
In other words, how do you explain that other than anti-Semitism?
Correct.
I want to ask you a very pointed question. Does opposing the existence of the state of Israel in its current form, in its current borders, does that make somebody anti-Semitic? No. Opposing Bibiism is not opposing Zionism. I think that there's often a conflation between those two things. And I think that there's this sort of canard that, again, it's this straw man put up where it's like criticizing like everyone's saying that I'm just trying to criticize Israel. Why is everyone calling me an anti-Semite? I call bullshit on that, and I will prove that to you right now. I believe that the state of Israel is betraying its Jewish values when it cozies up to neo-fascist regimes like Bolsonaro's Brazil and Viktor Orban's Hungary. I think it is betraying the legacy of 6 million Jews that are murdered. I think it is disgusting that the rabbinate, the ultra-Orthodox rabbinate in Israel, holds a stranglehold on Jewish life in the Jewish state. I was spit on when I went to the Kotel in March. You were spit on when you went to the Western Wall?
Yeah, they were like, oh, you're a journalist. And then they actually called me Vashti, which some people in this room will appreciate. It was around Purim, but it was kind of like a coded, she's a character in the Purim story who's sort of like this, like immodest wife of the king. Anyway, it was a very, like, I appreciated the insult because it was kind of biblical. But I was spit on at the Kotel, and, you know, like, do I think that that's a tragedy? Do I think, of course I do. But would I say then to someone that that's all of Israel, or, you know, that, like, to me it's the same thing as saying Trump is now the president of the United States, therefore we need to disavow America and everything it's ever stood for. That's crazy to me. I would never want that to be asked of me. And I would want to be able to oppose this prime minister as I do and still believe in the ideals that the Jewish state was founded on. People seem to forget, like, Zionism, what is Zionism? Zionism is the most ancient Jewish yearning. It is the yearning that is encoded in the most holy, in the Bible, something the founders of this country, which is a much longer conversation, fundamentally understood. And it's about the yearning to return to this particular piece of real estate. Is it inconvenient that it was there now? Sure. But that's a 5,000-year-old thing. The actual state of Israel, the modern state of Israel, is 70 years old. It is a baby. Who knows what it will look like? I think it's patriotic to call for a two-state solution. And I think it's Zionist. I think it's a Zionist argument to want Israel to live up to its ideals, to be truly the liberal democracy in the Middle East. I don't think any honest person talking in good faith would ever suggest that that is anti-Semitism. What I think anti-Semitism is saying there should never be a Jewish state anywhere between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. And that is what the BDS movement suggests. They try and deny that that's what they suggest, but they absolutely suggest that. And I think that, you know, and they'll frame it in this really lovely way. They'll say, we want a binational state. really a great thing to say from the vantage point of like Berkeley or Brooklyn. But I'm sorry, the reality of the Middle East is what happened to Jamal Khashoggi in that Saudi embassy. It is absolutely brutal in ways that you and I, in our daily life, could never even imagine. And if you want to see what it looks like to be a minority without an army in the Middle East, look at the fate of the Zoroastrians, or the Yazidis, or frankly, the Christians who are undergoing an exodus from the place where all of the great things in Christianity happened. That is the reality. And so I think that people that claim to be anti-Zionists or claim to be, thinking that a binational state can kind of work, they have to be forced to contend with what reality and politics on the ground in the Middle East actually are. And that's a very uncomfortable conversation to have, but I think it's really important to confront people who are making that argument with those counterpoints.
I want to briefly turn to Islam and Europe. From my
light topics. I tried to avoid this chapter, honestly, in my book. I wanted to avoid it.
It's interesting. Your book covers America left and right, and then there is a significant chapter on what's happening in Europe. And it's interesting to hear you say that perhaps you struggle with the topic. It's a complicated one. From my reading of that chapter in your book, you detect a meaningful change in Europe based in part on the flow of immigrants who are Muslim there, and as a result, how it feels to be a Jew in Europe. And I want you to kind of briefly explain what you have found.
Sure. Anyone who knows Jews in Europe knows that they all have a plan, if they have any money at all. And the ones in places like France, many of them have already lived out that plan, which is they move here, they move to Israel. I know many people in England right now who have told me privately that they have a plan if Jeremy Corbyn were ever to become prime minister.
And when you say plan?
I mean a plan to leave. I mean a plan to drag out the suitcase that Jews have carried around for thousands of years and move on to the next place, which is something we're very accustomed to doing. It's just amazing to me that this is happening, that this is happening in countries where survivors of the Holocaust are still walking around the streets where they were once rounded up is amazing to me. I was speaking to a very prominent French Jewish writer who's, I won't share his name because he probably wouldn't care, but I won't share his name. And he told me that whenever he's on the metro in Paris and he's reading a Jewish book, he covers up the cover of the Jewish book. To be a Jew walking the streets of some of the most cosmopolitan and refined cities in Europe, to be a Jew or someone who looks like they have a Jewish face, whatever that means, or someone like Alain Finkielkraut, who's a prominent Jew, where the Yellow Vest protester shouted at him, "Fascist, kike, go home to Tel Aviv," when he was walking out of his apartment the other day. It just means increasingly to risk your physical safety. That is what it means. And so the Jews of Europe are living their lives partially in the closet. Either they're taking off their kippah when they walk out in public, or they're hiding their Jewish star, their Magen David, inside their shirt, or they're hiding their real ideas and beliefs, and they're saving them sort of for the privacy of their own kitchen table, which is another kind of closeting.
Where does this come from in Europe? We've done a compelling job of understanding the sources of anti-Semitism on the left and the right in the US. What is the source in your mind of this in Europe? So
there's three sources, and the same sources that are here. I wrote a column about sort of Europe's three-headed dragon. There's the anti-Semitism of the far left of the Corbyn variety. And this causes Jews to kind of hide their affection for Israel or their feelings about Jewish particularism or whatever, their ideas, because they fear either social ostracism or moral vilification. You're the bad guy, you're the oppressor, you're on the wrong side of history, you're the racist kind of thing. Why ruin a dinner party? Let's avoid the topic. Then there's the sort of blood and soil nationalism that the Holocaust, that's still very much there in countries like you look at Hungary, you look at Sweden, these are real political parties with real constituencies. And those are sort of the heirs to Nazism. And then you have this new factor, which is the influx of immigrants from the Muslim world. And guess what? Unfortunately, we don't check our ideas at the borders of countries that we're entering. And a lot of these immigrants, some of whom just want to assimilate and have a better life, many of whom do, but some of them are bringing just very, very retrograde ideas about Jews, but not just about Jews, also about gay people and women. And oftentimes, these are the people that are committing violent assaults in cities like Paris or Berlin, for example. I just want to be sensitive about how I talk about this topic, because one of the things that's really hard about it is that Muslims in Europe are themselves subject to systemic discrimination in any number of ways. I think it's the same reason that it's really hard to talk about the anti-Semitic expressions of someone like Ilhan Omar, because she herself is completely demonized by the President of the United States, the most powerful person in the world. So it's very hard to sort of hold two things.
In a racialized way.
Very, very much. So it's a very hard thing to hold two things in your head at one time, that a person can be a victim of vile bigotry and they can themselves hold bigoted ideas. And that's one of the reasons I think that people avoid the topic of talking about Islamist anti-Semitism, because, like, you know, I think about Alan Kurdi. Do you guys remember who that is? He was the boy from Syria that washed up on the beach of Turkey with his family, the one in the red t-shirt, that all of us knew his name for a minute until the next tragedy happened and we moved on. Those are the people that are fleeing to a better life in the West. And so it's very, very hard to talk about this without wanting to contribute in any way to the perpetual victimization or the genuine xenophobia against people that are seeking a better life. So, you know, anyway, I'll leave it there. Mm-hmm. I'll leave it there.
I want to get to questions that you all have sent us, but I want to end our conversation, Bari, with what I think is going to be the answer to the question posed in the title of your book, which is how to fight anti-Semitism. So we've talked about the diagnosis of problems in America and in Europe, and I want to talk about the solutions. Mm-hmm. What in your mind is the solution and the answer to the question of how to fight anti-Semitism?
I think I could say it in a few words, which is be a proud Jew. Okay, I'm being a little glib, but I think that's a really, really important piece of it, which is, did Jewish civilization sustain itself because we contorted ourselves to try and fit the surrounding society? Or did Jewish civilization sustain and renew itself and offer some radical world-changing values and ideas that changed the world because we were willing to be out of step? And I think that is, the answer to that, to me, is extremely, extremely clear. And I think that is something we should take heart in. Sort of our our homelessness that many of us are feeling, and our loneliness. That's a very Jewish thing. That goes back to Abraham, right? Like, who is the guy, like the first Jew of all in the world is the guy who's called on by God to smash the idols his father worshipped and to go off into the desert and be a wandering Jew and to start his own new idea. The new idea being one God. And that idea completely transformed the world. And that's the first Jew. Like, that's our original sort of DNA, moral DNA. And so I think sort of going back to that is really important. The other thing I think is important is, I carry a tote bag from the New York Times. One of our mottos, right, is the truth is hard. And what I think the tote bag means by that, and the New York Times mean by that, is that gathering the truth is hard. It's a very hard thing. Mm-hmm. But also telling the truth is really hard. And I think that's something that's sort of really, my first rule, I give like 30 prescriptions for how to fight anti-Semitism, and the first one in there is tell the truth. Don't try and pretend that something is what it isn't. You believe your own eyes and ears when you hear something, and don't be afraid to call it out. I think that one thing that gives me tremendous optimism is that the fight in America is easier, not just because of what I described happened in Pittsburgh, but because the ideals of America are at their best, I'm talking about, are really harmonious with Jewish ones. The founders saw themselves as enacting a modern exodus. They talked about, Benjamin Franklin wanted the image on the Great Seal of this country to be Moses parting the Red Sea. They were fleeing tyrants too. They wanted to be a free people in their own land. I mean, I could go on. It's really quite amazing. And in the book, I talk about this letter that George Washington sent to the first Jewish congregation in Rhode Island, talking about how, unlike in all of history, the Jews of America would possess sort of equality. Now, of course, that was before, that was before everyone in this country was considered fully human. Slavery the Civil War would come to sort of fight to make that promise more real. But the Jewish experience in this country has been sort of unique in history, I would say, and I still feel that way, even after Pittsburgh and Poway. And I think that, one thing I think about a lot is that Jews are the obvious victims of anti-Semitism. The people that were beaten in Brooklyn last week, they're the obvious victims. But the other huge victim is the surrounding society. Societies where anti-Semitism rises or thrives are societies that are dying or are already dead. And so the answer needs to be, if we care about this country surviving and thriving and living up to its ideals, we sure as hell better fight this thing, because it is the canary in the coal mine for a society that's unraveling.
I can't think of a better place to end our conversation for the moment. Okay, so several of you have sent questions in, and I am going to give voice to those questions.
We were scared, I think, it was going to be a rowdier audience than it is. It seems very polite.
So rowdy, so rowdy. So I'm going to start with this question from Deborah. She asks, today the Deborah? Any Deborah? Today, the Israel I grew up learning about and visiting, the Israel of Theodore Herzl and Martin Buber, feels like a myth, something akin to Avalon or Camelot. How do modern
question? I love this. Okay.
How do modern Jews reconcile the dream of peaceful Israel with the reality of today's Israel, riddled with conflict? Now, in my 60s, Israel feels like a failure of imagination and morality. One woman's view. How do contemporary Jews fight for that? How do contemporary Jews fight for that and defend themselves against criticism?
That's a great question, Deborah. I hope you're here. Hi, Deborah. So I'd say a few things. One is that I sympathize. I grew up with that same mythology. And Mati Friedman, who's an Israeli writer that I really recommend to all of you, he writes sort of regularly for this newspaper, and he has a few books out. He talks about how diaspora Jews, and especially American Jews, they love an Israel that doesn't exist, and they hate an Israel that doesn't exist. And what he means by that is that, Israel's not Paris of the Middle East. It's something different. It's native. Most of the Jews, as I mentioned before, who live in Israel are of the Arab world. And that is just a different reality. And I think that it's important to recognize what I said before, that it's so young and it's still in formation, but also that it's the fact that it's indigenous and of the East shouldn't surprise us, right? Like, it was always there. It wasn't here. And I think that we were taught, or at least I was taught, certainly in Pittsburgh, a very Ashkenazi normative view of Jewish history and of Israel. And I think one of the things that's important for all of us to do is to really learn the other story. That's something that I'm trying to do a lot myself, is understand what is the North African and Middle Eastern story that is really different than mine? And why are the politics of those people so different than mine? It's because they're coming from a region of the world that I can't fully grapple with. So I think that it's important to get to know it. And then, of course, the obvious answer is to visit and to think about, one thing I've been thinking a lot about is, what does Jewish peoplehood, we talk a lot about Jewish peoplehood in the Jewish community and the divisions in Jewish peoplehood. But I think there's an exciting conversation to be had, which is what does Jewish peoplehood look like in a time where it's sort of bipolar, where mostly Jews aren't spread out over all the corners of the world like they used to be, but where it's sort of two poles of power here and there. And what does it look like, where we have sort of had the privilege of, in this country, because we've been largely so accepted, of embracing all the liberal values that all of us in this room know. But Israel, because of its location in the world, has had to fulfill that other thing that we talk a lot about Judaism, which is choosing life and protecting life. And they've been hard-headed, and we've gotten to be open-hearted. And how can we find a way to sort of marry those two things? And that's something I think a lot about, and I think is sort of one of the questions for what does Jewish peoplehood look like in the 21st century? Is it maybe more oriented toward the East than the West? I don't know. But I really appreciate it. I feel the same way. I feel like I was like mugged by reality, like during the second Intifada.
There was one more question about Israel that Stuart wrote. I won't read the whole thing, but I want to address its thrust, which is he asks how Jews should respond to Israel's annexation, in his words, of the West Bank. And I wonder how you think about that.
I personally think that occupying another people indefinitely is, and depriving them of equal rights is an absolutely untenable future for Israel. That's what I think. So that probably puts me at odds with many people in this room, but I really feel that way, and I really feel, as I said before, that we have to find a way sort of to divorce. We need to find a way of finding a sort of a cold divorce, let's call it, between the Israelis and the Palestinians. I don't know what that looks like, but I certainly don't think that indefinite continued occupation is tenable if Israel wants to continue to believe that it is the only democracy in the Middle East.
Alex, if you're here, wrote a lovely email. He wrote, most of us in this room over a certain age have been confronted individually with a direct or indirect insult that's anti-Semitic. Mm-hmm. My first, Alex writes, was when I was about 12 and I got a new baseball mitt and I didn't want to share it with another guy. His name was Kevin, and he'll never forget when Kevin called him a, quote, cheap Jew as a result. And he says, I had no response and I was in shock as other kids watched. This has only become more pronounced in social media. How do we respond individually to direct insults like these?
Is that you? Someone raised their hand. That's you. I feel.
Thanks for this note, Alex.
Thank you. I think it's really, I mean, I wrote a book called How to Fight Anti-Semitism, yet I find that to be the most challenging thing of all, because it is shocking. I met a man 2 days ago, a young first-year law student at NYU, who's from the Orthodox community and went to Yeshiva University, and he's wearing his big kippah, walking around NYU, and his second day there, someone just started screaming at him, effing Jew. And he came to me and was with tears in his eyes, like, what do I do in that situation? I honestly think the only thing to do in that situation is try not to lose your cool, although I think it's understandable if one does. I certainly have myself. And just think about the people that approached being denigrated with dignity. I think in that situation, this didn't come to me at the moment when he asked me this question. I emailed it to him later. But I think about 1957, I think they're called the Little Rock Nine. The famous picture of, I think her name's Elizabeth Eckford, a 15-year-old girl, black teenager, wearing glasses, and there's screaming racists right behind her. That's a person that we remember as a hero. And I think it's just really important to just never bow our heads and never internalize the idea that we have something to apologize for, or that we've brought this on ourselves. And I think that that's something that's actually like quite a deep problem, sort of theologically in Judaism, which is a conversation for another time, which is that because the Jews were always oppressed, we had to find ways to explain this. Like, why would God want this for us? And a lot of Jewish theology is like, aha, why did the Second Temple fall? It fell because of ceaseless hatred between Jews. No, the Second Temple fell because there was a stronger army than the Jews. And I think that that's something that's like very psychological and internal. And I just think it's really important to use and this is, I guess, the second thing I would say, when you're punched in the gut, and I'll say for myself after Pittsburgh, there's a very visceral reaction, even after the shock wears off. For me, it was like, I'm gonna wear a Jewish star, which I always thought was redundant for me. Like, I don't need to do this. But I did, because I felt like I needed to like assert myself in a more aggressive way. And I think that if it stops there though, like with the feeling of wanting to punch back, that's sort of a missed opportunity. I think the chance that we're having right now, as a Jewish community certainly, but beyond that, is, and certainly I think America has this opportunity in the moment where we're being sort of like continually punched in the gut by this president and sort of by like our broken culture, is like, okay, we're broken right now. Bad things are happening. How are we going to renew ourselves? What do we want to be? What is the American story that we can tell? What does a healthy version of patriotism that rejects blood and nationalism look like? Blood and soil nationalism. And for Jews, what does it mean to be an American Jew in 2019? Maybe, you know, and I just think that those are the kind, like we want to sort of be getting to like the positive expressions of Jewish identity and looking at it as an opportunity to explore more who we are. And, you know, the thing missing is how to fight anti-Semitism. Okay, but why are we fighting it? What are we fighting for? That's the fundamental thing. The Jews did not survive this long because we were anti-Semites. That's a really lame thing. And if that's our reason for being, we might as well go ahead and like be consigned to the dustbin of history. We survived because we had radical, amazing things to share with the world. And I really believe that's still true, and that the next chapter and the next iteration is sort of like ours to be written. And I think if anything amazing can come from this really ugly and precarious and uncertain moment, it's that. It's to realize what we are fighting for.
Okay, this is a perfect final coda question from Manning. How do we get more Jewish writers, TV producers, filmmakers,
I love it,
to start telling the Jewish story and tell it, I'm taking a little license with the question, and tell it better and bigger?
That is an amazing question, and I'm actually thinking about that quite a lot. I want to give one example, which is in the book, do you guys know who Ben Hecht is? Okay, I love it. Well, many people don't know who Ben Hecht is, and Ben Hecht was one of the most important screenwriters of his generation. He worked on Gone with the Wind. There's 2 new really interesting books out about Ben Hecht. And Ben Hecht was an assimilated Jew in Hollywood. Ben Hecht sort of woke up, as it were, to who he was and his role in Jewish history during the Holocaust. And Ben Hecht did this unbelievable thing in 1943. He organized it was called a pageant, but a show, kind of like a musical review, called We Will Never Die. Okay? It was a very, like, not such a subtle message. And he took this show and had all of these celebrities participate in it and filled up Madison Square Garden and traveled around the country doing it. I love the idea, like, I want Sacha Baron Cohen, Sarah Silverman, Natalie Portman, if you're watching this, we should do that right now. And I think it's, you know, there are hints of it, right? I mean, Stiesel's a great example of Jewish stories that I couldn't imagine being told 10 years ago on Netflix. Really recommend it. Fauda, certainly. So we are seeing hints of it, but I think it's an amazing challenge for really, you know, not to be conspiratorial, but the Jews had a lot to do with building Hollywood because they were kept out of every other industry, honestly. And so I think, you know, I think that there's something quite amazing about how a person can sort of wake up and decide to be more assertive in their Jewish identity and more assertive in the Jewish story. And I want to leave people with sort of one last thing that I've been thinking a lot about on that theme, which is that I always grew up with this idea that Theodor Herzl sort of like, you know, the idea of Zionism, like political Zionism, modern Zionism, like sprang forth from his head like Athena or whatever that myth is. And I didn't know this. Maybe you guys seem very Jewishly educated and well-educated in general, and maybe you already knew this, but his original solution to the Jewish question that was bearing down on Europe was sort of the opposite of self-determination. In 1895, he writes The Jewish State, which is where he lays out this vision. But in 1893, 2 years before that, he published an article in which he said the only way for the Jews of the Austro-Hungarian Empire to be accepted is a mass conversion to Catholicism. He literally wrote an article in like what was the Anti-Defamation League publication at the time, calling for a mass conversion, a mass procession at 2 p.m. at high noon so everyone would see. All of the Jews would walk through the streets to St. Stephen's Cathedral where they would be baptized. It's amazing to me that in the span of 2 years, he goes from that solution, which is of course not a solution, it's self-mutilation, and it is an answer to the Jewish question born out of despair and fear, to the idea of Jewish self-assertion and Jewish self-determination, and the idea that Jews can live full and free lives. And he dies in 1904. What's so amazing is he was so confident in his vision that in his will he talked about that he wanted his bones to be taken to the land of Israel when the state was established, and they were in 1949. So I just think that's an amazing thing to think about, like, you know, when he wrote The Jewish State, he still had a Christmas tree in his home. He didn't really know how to speak Hebrew. When the chief rabbi of Vienna went to visit him during Hanukkah, and he saw him putting up a Christmas tree. So I'm just leaving all of you with that, and Ben Hecht also, to say that, like, maybe it's you. Maybe you're the person with the next idea that's going to totally transform the Jewish world and the world itself. And I just was so moved when a lot of people know this who know about Herzl, but I was really shocked by it, and I think it's a sort of moving message for a simple Jew, not a Torah scholar, not a leader, not a natural leader, someone with no connections. That is the only person named in the Declaration of the State of Israel. So I'll leave it there.
Bari, I want to tell you that you are a complete joy to interview.
Thank you.
And it's been such a wonderful conversation. Thank you, Bari.